very high, and so I need a long skirt to avoid the awkward skirt tugging.
Very good point. Yes, I too am wearing a long skirt. All right, Patrick, are we live? Oh, we are live.
Okay.
Well, okay.
Hello, audience
Hi,
out there.
hi, virtual audience. Sorry for the banter.
And
Here
hello,
we go.
studio audience.
Right. So I'm thinking they're here between rainstorms because, as you know, if you live in Phoenix, if it rains, you're pretty sure you're going to melt.
Oh, dear.
Right.
Like a sugar cube.
No, it's actually it's the roads. It's just hard. I was explaining to Lauren. Maybe you virtual audience people don't realize this, but Phoenix is the largest city in the country geographically, bigger than Los Angeles. We don't have any public transportation except for just like one route that goes from Mesa to the airport. No, seriously. So everybody who is here has driven or taken Uber, or did you ride? Anybody ride their bike, motorcycle?
Rickshaw.
And so, traffic is heavy and it's very long distances. And so I'm always appreciative of those of you who've actually driven here.
Yes.
Thank you very much for doing that.
Thank you for taking the trouble to get here.
Right. So, Lauren, as many of you may know, when we first met writing the Pink Carnation series, still one of my very favorite lovely historicals. Well, tell us a little bit about it.
About the Pink Carnation series?
Absolutely.
Oh, goodness.
We're going to work our way to the girl from Greenwich Street.
Well, funnily enough, I know this is the 20th anniversary of the Pink Carnation series, which came out in February of 2004. 2005. It absolutely boggles my brain. And I started writing it when I was 24. So at the end of this month, I will have been living with the Pink Carnation series for half my life. So those books were madcap romps set during the Napoleonic Wars. They were a mashup of Georgette Heyer, The Scarlet Pimpernel, Zorro, Julia Quinn. It was every masked hero romance you can think of, and a little bit of Regency romance and some Blackadder thrown in, with a modern frame character, a frustrated Harvard grad student who was desperately trying to find sources for her dissertation on the Napoleonic Wars, flowery spies during the Napoleonic Wars, and he was very frustrated that spies did not, in fact, leave written records, which was because at the time I was a frustrated Harvard grad student who was very frustrated by the fact that spies didn't leave written records. And those books were really, my plan had been to go and get my PhD in history so I could write very serious historical fiction based absolutely on the sources. And I wrote that first Pink Carnation book out of frustration. It was partially wish fulfillment with a graduate student finding the cache of papers I never found, and partially written out of my own disillusionment at realizing there was no such thing as absolutely accurate history. That even in the historical record, as a very responsible historian sitting there with footnotes, there are gaps. And people make imaginative leaps and triangulate. And I was very frustrated by this lack of certitude. And so I turned it into an asset by having a heroine who finds the documents and makes those leaps. The irony is this book sitting here in front of you today is the opposite of that. This book is based entirely on real people doing real things and involved an archival deep dive to try to fill in gaps in the historical record and to correct what I think are very long-standing historical misapprehensions about a very famous true crime and trial. So in some ways, these cases are interesting. These books, are interesting bookends. And they take place at roughly the same time. The Pink Carnation books, the first one it begins in 1802. This book takes place in 1800, but on the other side of the pond in New York.
Very true. So you thought that I was off target by talking about the Pink Carnation. It was a soft lead into...
and we bring it full circle.
Right. And so Lauren, with a solid, history of law behind her, or solid career in law behind her, has taken advantage of her legal training to bring to life one of our first, was it our first actual?
No, and everyone says that, and it's one of the many wrong things
Okay.
that get said about this case, including on my cover by my publisher. It's not actually America's first murder trial. It's America's first fully recorded murder trial. There have been plenty of murders before that, and plenty of trials. You know, man's been killing man since Cain and Abel. It would be really nice to think this was the first murder in America, but no. But what happened was the clerk of the court had learned this cool new thing called shorthand. And he decided this trial was crazy. It lasted 2 days, which was unprecedented. They had no mechanism for dealing with this at the time. When the trial hit about 2 in the morning on the first night and only half of the prosecution's witnesses had been called, they had no idea what to do. And the judge was like, we can power through. And the jurors were like, you've got to be kidding me. We want to go home. And they wound up putting them, this was in Federal Hall in New York, the same building where George Washington was inaugurated. And they put them in the picture room on the floor with blankets and refreshments so they could pick up the following morning. There was no idea of jury sequestration. They hadn't come up. This was sort of one of the early examples of that, and they're figuring it out on the fly. But anyway, it went into the wee hours of the morning the next night, and they wrap it up largely because no one wanted to spend another night on the floor of the picture room. But the clerk of the court took down these 2 very full days of impassioned and crazy testimony with all sorts of ridiculous stuff coming out on the stand. People are barred from the courtroom and burst back in again. Secrets, lies, adultery, all sorts of twists get blurted out there on the stand. And we know because William Coleman was there taking it all down. And then he published a 99-page verbatim transcript of the trial, or relatively close to verbatim. There are some issues, you know, as one would suspect, but it's a pretty amazing document. But so that's what it really is. It's America's first fully recorded murder trial.
So what a good time you had trawling through all 99 pages, right?
Oh, so much fun. Because the voices of the characters, because it's actually, and some legal historians have commented, it's not like modern trials. So if you, like me, were a litigator, you have to forget everything you think you know. Because as a litigator now, you tell your clients, say as little as possible. You know, answer the question short, to the point. You rehearse with people, you prep them so they don't say more than they need to. This, legal historians have pointed out, it's almost more like the European inquisitorial system, where it's a fact-finding exercise rather than, you know, what we do. And so the witnesses are asked broad questions and they just go and they talk. And so their voices and their characters come across so clearly across these couple of hundred years.
So let's go back to the beginning and talk about who are the people and what was the crime?
So on December 22nd, 1799, a young woman named Elma Sands put on her best dimity petticoat. She put on her finest calico dress. She went next door. She borrowed a muff from the neighbor. And a little after 8 o'clock that night, she left her Quaker cousin's boarding house at 208 Greenwich Street, and she never came back. About 2 weeks later, on January 2nd, her body was found floating in the Manhattan Well in Lispenard's Meadow to the north of the city. When I say, by the way, to the north of the city, this is still south. For those of you who know New York, it's south of present-day Greenwich Village. The city was very small and clustered at the very tip of the island. And within a few hours of her body being found, a young carpenter who also lived at the boarding house was arrested for her murder. And the story immediately spread through the city that Levi Weeks had seduced her under promise of marriage and then strangled her and flung her into the well to avoid having to follow through. And the city was inflamed. Everyone believed that Levi had done it. It played very nicely into the popular fiction of the period, which, if anyone else remembers, Clarissa and Pamela and the other novels of Samuel Richardson about young women seduced and betrayed. These were really big at the time. And people are like, yes, of course he's an evil seducer who threw her into a well to avoid marriage. And anyway, the city was baying for Levi's blood, and particularly because the family invited the city in to view poor betrayed Elma's battered undiscovered corpse. They put her body in a coffin in their front room, and people trooped through looking and examining. Some claimed to be medical professionals, but most weren't. And when so many people wanted to see the corpse, more than could fit into the parlor, they put her out in the street in front of the boarding house so everyone could see what Levi had done to her. But Levi might be a humble carpenter, but his older brother, Ezra Weeks, was a wealthy and well-connected contractor. And at a time when the city was growing rapidly, good contractors had a lot of clout. And so he quietly, behind the scenes, assembled a legal dream team consisting of Brockholst Livingston, who, unless you're a lawyer or a New York history buff, you won't have heard from, but he was an absolutely vicious criminal defense lawyer, and Aaron Burr and Alexander Hamilton. The three of them had to save this young man from the gallows right in the threshold of the 1800 New York elections, where Burr and Hamilton are tearing each other to shreds because they know whoever wins the New York elections is going to win the presidency. But they have to team up to save this man from the gallows. And it sounds crazy, but this all actually happened.
It's not any crazier than today. I mean, I think we could all sort of go with that.
There's a lot of crazy.
Well, but I mean, so it was between Burr and Hamilton. It wasn't necessarily just about defending Levi Weeks. It was also a political stepping stone to, both of them. But we know how that played out.
Right, because they knew this was going to be the media sensation of
Right.
the year. I mean, in an era before reality TV, before radio, everyone in the city is talking about the Levi Weeks trial.
Well, but they did have broadsheets. I mean, they did have, kind of instant publication where, they could print up stuff and hawk it on all the street. I mean, I remember growing up when there were like 2 papers a day. There was the morning paper in Chicago, the Tribune, and then the afternoon paper, the Chicago Daily News. And, and that kept you reasonably current. But, back then, I mean, Ben Franklin was a huge printer of broadsheets in Philadelphia. So people in, cities were small. Printing presses were active. People were reasonably well informed.
Oh, there are articles appearing in the New York papers from as soon as January 4th on, and they are all filled with articles about Levi's seduction and betrayal of Elma. And one of the ways we know when Burr and Brockholst and Hamilton are on the case is because an op-ed appears in the New York Gazette on January 10th, urging people to suspend their opinion in the case of this young man accused of killing this young woman, because, really he's a young man of universally good repute, and the woman, she might have been a bit melancholy. And maybe she had been heard to utter things that might lead towards self-destruction. So maybe there's more to this case than it seems. And so, this is a fight that is also played out in the press, because the press initially, and there are so many papers, and people read them avidly. And luckily for us, the New York Historical Society and other organizations have these papers, so we can see what people were reading and what was being printed and what they were saying about this trial. But the defense team also starts fighting this in the press.
So this is a New York City crime? It's New York's crime. It's not a federal crime.
It's a New York. It's the people of the state of New York versus Levi
Right.
Weeks, but it's reported as far away as Philadelphia and Boston. This particular crime catches people's imaginations.
Why?
I really think it's because it so closely echoes the fiction of the day. Most people will never have heard of, there's a book called Charlotte Temple. It was the runaway bestseller in America in the 1790s. Some people say it's the first novel to have written in America. I don't know if that's true or not, but it's basically an American Samuel Richardson knockoff about a young woman who is, wait for it, seduced and betrayed. And this was one literary scholar I read said that no book sold more copies until the 20th century.
That's
it was
really
a huge
fascinating.
bestseller, and people were reading in New York. They were reading Charlotte Temple, or they knew and disapproved of people who did. And so everyone, and again, in Philadelphia and Boston too, they were reading Charlotte Temple. And so I think the Elma Sands murder and Levi Weeks trial, it fits into the scaffolding that's already in people's heads.
But, I mean, Richardson wrote that book, Pamela, in 1749. So 50 years on, I read Pamela. I staggered all the way through Pamela, and then I tried to read Clarissa.
Well, there was a good BBC adaptation of
There
Clarissa
was.
with Sean Bean as
Right.
Lovelace and knee breeches.
Well, so here's a couple of
Highly
things. Since we're
watchable.
talking about this early fiction, it may not be absolutely, but in many respects, Pamela was like the first novel. And so here are the questions confronting a person writing a novel for the first time. Who's going to tell the story? Who is going to be the narrator of the novel? And how is the story going to be structured? And Richardson solved it by writing it as an epistolary novel. So the structure was determined by the fact that letters were written and sent to be read, and the letters were answered. Meg Cabot did a really wonderful riff on that some years ago. I can't remember it using email. But the other thing is, since different people were writing the letters, then he had different voices telling you the story, so you could determine. I thought it was brilliant, as a way. Jane Austen's first published work was what's it called? Lady Susan? I think it's Lady Susan. Anyway, it's an epistolary novel too, before she started writing her better-known novels.
Right, and Fanny Burney's Evelina.
Yes.
Which I was
Which I've
obsessed
also
with
read,
at upper
yeah.
school. And there really needs to be a good BBC adaptation of that one.
Absolutely.
Because unlike Clarissa, that one has a happy ending.
So I've even read the French one, Les Liaisons Dangereuses by Claude Lacau in French.
Well, speaking of books that have adaptations.
I know. It was great, but I mean, I read it in French, but it's the same kind of a thing. And I think, it's really fascinating to me that storytellers came up with these solutions, to how to write a novel, how to give characters voices, how to structure the story, and then it kept evolving. But what's interesting to me is that was like 50 years before the time were they slow to come to the U.S.?
Well, I'm trying to remember what year Charlotte Temple came out. I think it was 1794. So this was it was either 1791 or 1794. I think it was 1794. Someone out there in video land can go correct me and write in the chat. Oh my God, she's so wrong. It was totally 1791. But that was a relatively recent book. So this was the book everyone was passing around and reading at the time. But it was definitely inspired. It was part of that same continuum as the Richardson novel. Of course, it's not like today when you have everyone and their mother writing a novel. Novels, there weren't as many of them around. Older ones had a longer life.
But even one story structure. Look at Gone Girl. I mean, we're still reading Gone Girl. I mean, we still are. I mean, it's surprising how that one particular story structure, the trust no one, the unreliable narrator, the wicked twist, and all. It was original when we read it back in 2011, I think. Not so original now. It's it's like the Da Vinci Code. I mean, I'm telling you that for like 5 or 6 years after the Da Vinci Code, almost every book that came my way was a religious conspiracy thriller. We called them Da Vinci clones. He's got a new book coming out in September, and I'm going to be really interested to see whether it's going to make a big splash or whether we're all kind of done with the religious conspiracy thriller. And, we are moving on right now from Gone Girl to romantasy. Romantasy is the thing.
Well, it's
Sex and dragons, but not sex with dragons, is my definition of romantasy.
Maybe that will be the next step.
And on the other hand, the historical novel and the cozy, and I think a lot of this is because in these difficult times with a lot of uncertainty and a lot of incivility and all, comfort reading, we all crave that, better to go somewhere. Think about the Regency. That was a war. The Napoleonic War lasted for 20 years, and no one knew how it was going to end until Waterloo, and in fact, nobody knew how Waterloo was going to end until very late in the day. 20 years of a war. That was a long period of uncertainty. It was like a gift to you for the, Pink Carnation series. But, imagine living through that without ever knowing how it was going. Well, we may find out how it was coming out. But I think that's also one reason why people like Jane Austen, and she didn't write about it. She had 2 brothers who were admirals who were, engaged in the fight. But that's not read Persuasion. Well, no, that's not true because there is a
Well,
there
Admiral
is a
Wentworth.
yeah, right. So
Charlotte
yeah.
Temple was published in 1791.
Okay,
Thank
so it
you,
was
Patrick.
1791.
The voice from the back room. I love
Thank
it.
you. But it was
Right.
still pretty current in
Yeah.
1799.
But anyway,
Mm-hmm.
so part of what I was leading up to, a long way around here, is
Mm-hmm.
that we had lived through the Revolution, we had lived through the Loyalists, that we had written a constitution.
Mm-hmm.
There had been a tremendous period of upheaval for 50 years in this country, and I can understand why something like Charlotte Temple would have captured the public. It wasn't political. It wasn't about war.
It actually plays into this because the evil seducer is a British army officer who brings her to America and abandons her. So it actually also plays into those post-revolutionary feelings about the Brits as bad guys. And so it is. And actually, as you were saying about periods of uncertainty, we don't usually think of, we think about the revolution and that's like, oh, great, yay, new republic. It's all good. We have these monumental founding fathers who are larger than life figures to us. But what we don't realize is that they're living through times of uncertainty after the revolution, that you have that burst of the Constitutional Convention and the new nation being forged. But then what happens after? Because the disagreements that are being aired in the Constitutional Convention, the character differences between the participants, and the differences between different parts of the country, they're still there. They haven't gone away. They haven't been resolved. And this particular period in 1800, there is a real sense of despondency about the fate of the nation. George Washington has just died. He dies a little bit before Elma Sands. Gouverneur Morris gives his funeral oration. Hamilton, the new head of the Society of the Cincinnati, marches in the procession. And of course, for Hamilton, Washington wasn't just, the great peacemaker, the head of the country who's smoothing over a lot of these cracks in the facade. He's Hamilton's father figure. He's his mentor, and then he dies. And Hamilton really feels like the Republicans are going to tank the nation. He thinks that Burr and his cronies are completely wrong-minded, and they are going to ruin the new republic. And there are plenty of people who feel the same way about Hamilton and his Federalists, and there is a really apocalyptic feel to a lot of what's going on at the time, and a sense that these 1800 New York elections, the stakes are very high, and no one can understand where the optimism and idealism of 15 years before has gone. These are the men, Hamilton, Burr, Brockholst, Livingston, they're all roughly the same age. They're like a year apart, and they were all young men during the Revolution, and now they're in their mid-40s, and they're feeling jaded and disillusioned and cranky.
Cranky, right?
Yes.
I know. We know cranky, right? Got it. So tell us a little bit about Levi Weeks. Now, should I assume that there was was he Jewish? Was there an anti-Semitism element in this?
Not at all.
No.
Absolutely
So-
not. He was from Massachusetts.
Okay. So the
where his
Levi,
family was.
the Levi is not.
No,
from
I mean,
that.
biblical names were very common at the time.
Okay.
Yes. His older brother's Ezra. He's Levi. No, he was not
So
Jewish.
biblical names,
Yeah.
right? Okay.
So there was none of that aspect to it at all.
So who was
Okay. Who was he? His family had come over from Massachusetts to take part in basically New York's building boom, because New York is growing rapidly at this time. Actually, would anyone like to hazard a guess as to the population of New York in 1799?
he? 15,000.
Anyone else? What? 10. Wow, interesting. I had a group the other night who guessed 200,000. So they were way over. You guys are actually way under. New York had just doubled in size. In 1789, New York had 30,000 people. By 1799, they'd grown to 60,000. And so the city was expanding rapidly. And so people like Ezra and Levi Weeks, this was a great time to be a contractor and a carpenter. People were begging you to work for them. There are people building mansions and churches and grand federal buildings. And these guys, they had come from Massachusetts to New York, and they were doing very well here. And so Levi, it's an interesting thing because he's described as a laborer, as a carpenter. On the other hand, his brother is a man on the rise. with all of these connections. And Levi himself has dreams of being an architect in sort of the Palladian style. And so I think it's a time period where class distinctions were very different. And that's something to remember with Levi is he's a carpenter, he's living in a boarding house. On the other hand, he has some very powerful connections because the city is smaller and the class distinctions are smaller. As for Levi himself, we know very little about him. He was 26, he was a carpenter, and he lived at the boarding house. We don't hear Levi's voice because defendants at the time were not allowed to speak in their own defense. So his is one of the few voices. There are two major voices missing from the trial transcript, and one is Levi's and one is Elma's. We do have later letters from him, which gives a sense of what he sounded like, but not to give too much away. That's after the trial, and he is very embittered for the rest of his life after all this. No one's life is unscathed after this trial. Elma's family, Levi's family, all of their lives are torn apart by this. We have a sense that Levi is a bit of a flirt. He's very excited that there's not one, not two, but three good-looking young women who live in the boarding house. First, he flirts with Peggy Clark, who's employed in the millinery that Elma's cousin Catherine runs out of the boarding house. Then he walks out with Elma's first cousin Hope, and then he attaches himself to Elma. And it's very unclear what his actual relationship with her is.
Right. So what was Elma's, why was she in the boarding house? Did she work? What was she doing?
Well, this is an interesting story. So one of the things that drove me nuts, so a ton has been written about this trial. There have been 2 nonfiction books and a slew of articles and blogs and podcasts. And I had thought, well, okay, so most of the basic legwork will have been done. And one of the things that I discovered was that for all that's been written about this trial, very little has been done to find out anything about Elma. Most of these books get the basic facts of her life wrong. And I think that's because for most people, the main interest of this trial is Hamilton and Burr elbowing each other in the courtroom and trying to cut each other off at the knees. So Elma's just a convenient excuse to get Burr and Hamilton into the courtroom. She's a convenient corpse, and she's usually painted as either the innocent betrayed or a melancholy nymphomaniac laudanum addict. And it's one or the other. There's no in between. And the basic facts of her life are generally misreported. And a lot of these misrepresentations date back to those old newspaper articles. People get her name wrong. They call her Juliana Elmore Sands instead of Elma Sands. Her real name is Elma, because her uncle, David Sands, is a very prominent Quaker preacher. He's actually from a Presbyterian family, but had a intense conversion to Quakerism as a teenager and got some, but not all, of his family to convert with him. And Elma is the daughter of his much younger sister, who is a full generation younger than he is and gets pregnant at 16. And in the trial, they say Elma's mother was never married and that her father is alive and living in Charleston. And my theory is Elma's mother gets pregnant in 1777. One possibility is that her father was one of the soldiers passing through New Cornwall, New York. I mean, Elma's poor 16-year-old mom would not be the first person to fall for a handsome guy in a uniform who had a wife and children at home. So that could be it. Or, frankly, the father in Charleston could be a fiction made up to cover culpability closer to home. But these are things that never get. So anyway, Elma is raised in this Quaker household. I think she's named Elma because Elma is the name of William Penn's wife. And my theory, which I can't prove, is that Elma's 16-year-old mother, who's dependent on her older brother, who's the head of the family, is she's trying to soften him up by naming her illegitimate daughter after a famous Quaker woman. But Elma goes by Elma, not by Elma most of the time. And the papers can't wrap their heads around Elma, so they call her Juliana Elmore. Her middle name is not Elmore. It's a corruption of Elma, Because when you say Elma in the local accent at the time, it comes out sounding like Elma, Elmore. But these are the things I had to pick my way through and reconstruct from scratch, because a lot of the books refer to David Sands as her grandmother. They say her cousin was her aunt. They say she was a Quaker. She refused to join the Quaker meeting. So all of these things, I wound up trawling through Quaker meeting records, censuses, private family genealogies to figure out who Elma was, how she was raised, what her position in the family was, because I don't think you can understand where Elma went on the evening of December 22nd, 1799, or with whom, without understanding the forces that shaped Elma and who Elma was. And to do that, you have to know the basic things about her life. So anyway, that was a very long answer about who was Elma Sands. The shorter answer was she was the disgrace of the family. She was the unrepentant child of sin in a very devout Quaker family. Her cousin Catherine describes her as rather too gay for a Quaker, and then hastily adds, but she tried to change her dress and manner to please me. And you get the feeling it was like a little too late there. She refuses to join the meeting, although she's urged to. And she likes fine things. She borrows a handkerchief from a neighbor without asking, because she doesn't plan to use it anyway, so it shouldn't matter if she borrows it.
I'm still hung up on the idea that a convenient corpse would have been a great title. I've been sitting
That
here
would also
thinking
be a
about
good title
that.
for
Oh,
this
I
book,
love
A
that.
Convenient
Right.
Corpse. Well, because
So-
I do think most people just view her as a catalyst, and she gets flattened.
So did people actually try to investigate like rape or suicide when they found a corpse? You know, she was all properly dressed but dropped in the well. Did they have any thoughts about how she got there?
Oh, there's a fascinating medical wrangle about this. Also because the defense strategy is very interesting because it's very incoherent. And I think this is partially because, well, I mean, as I can say from my previous experience as a lawyer, yes, a lot of times lawyers, and you also were a lawyer, try to cover all possible grounds. So you'll moot multiple theories at the same time. But in this case, it doesn't work like that. When you follow the line of questioning at trial, you get a strong sense that there are two separate theories being presented by two separate camps, and they're undermining each other. So the defense first puts forth as a theory that Elma was melancholy and perhaps addicted to the odd tipple of laudanum and had been driven to take her own life by flinging herself in the well. The alternate theory is that no, Elma was in fact murdered, but there were people other than Levi Weeks who had reason to do her in. And so there is I will say, the melancholy laudanum addict suicide theory does not fly well at trial. There is a portion of the defense team that continues to push it, but no one buys it. On the other hand, you have a portion of the defense team coming up with alternate candidates for Elma's murder. But there's a big medical wrangle where they call multiple doctors to try to argue over what actually was done to Elma. But she'd been in the water from December 22nd to January 2nd, and we're at the infancy of all sorts of medical science. Right. And there's a big debate, including if anyone knows about Dr. David Hozick, who's very famous for his botanical gardens, who's talking about, what sort of lividity is normal in a body that's been in the water this long. Some doctors claim they see marks around her throat, like you would get from fingers pressing. Other doctors say, well, that's just normal, bruising you'd expect to get after the coroners have manhandled her and after she's been in the water all this time. And there is not much consensus on the evidence of Elma's body.
So did they look to see if she were pregnant?
Yes. They do. This is a big thing.
That they could at least have figured out,
because
no matter
of course,
how primitive.
Part of Team Anti-Levi's argument when Elma's body is found is that she's pregnant and he murders her to avoid having to marry her. And after the coroner's inquest, they very decisively say, no, she's not pregnant. However, one question no one bothers to ask, and I think this is a big clue to this case, is whether she had been pregnant. So there's a whole thing with the laudanum and melancholy. And again, this whole strategy of claiming that Elma is a melancholy laudanum addict, which has, this has had legs in that a very recent popular nonfiction book on this topic just states without question that, Elma was feeling melancholy because that was just the way she was. And she was longing for a tipple of laudanum because she really liked her laudanum. But if you look at the actual trial transcript and you look at it very carefully, there's a different story that emerges, and it hinges on this question of pregnancy. So are you guys ready for a slightly longer story? Okay. So summer of 1799, two big things happen. One is Levi moves into the boarding house, and the second is there's a yellow fever epidemic. And Elma's cousin Catherine takes her younger sister Hope and her 4 young children, and they leave the city and go to the family homestead in New Cornwall to get away from the yellow fever, leaving Elma behind to run the boarding house with Catherine's husband, Elias Ring, and all the male boarders. About a month into this, the neighbors report hearing the sounds of marital activity through the wall, and the voice of Elma and a man who I will not name because it will give too much away. But in September, my brain's going. Elias Ring sends a rather pathetic letter to his wife begging her to come back from the country because he's lonely. And Catherine, who is annoyed at her husband for various reasons, refuses and decides to let him stew for a few more weeks. And so she stays another 2 weeks after that. And when she does come back, Elma goes off to the country. When Elma comes back, in the end is around late November or very early December, Elma has a sudden, violent illness involving extreme cramping of the stomach. And she is so ill that Levi begs Catherine to send for the doctor because he's afraid she's going to die. And Catherine, who, may we add, has had 4 children, refuses, saying she'll be better by the morning. And it's after this sudden illness that Elma is prescribed laudanum for ongoing cramping. And it's after this that people notice a change in her mood. Because the testimony from all the witnesses who knew her growing up and who knew her prior to December of 1799, they testify that she is lively, possibly a little too lively. But there's one boarder who only comes to the boarding house in early December, and he testifies she's kind of moody. And I think they're both telling the truth. My theory, of course, is she had an affair with someone. She got pregnant. She lost the child either by miscarriage or by design, and almost died, and was prescribed laudanum for the pain. And yeah, she would be melancholy after that. But what fascinates me is no one at the time or after, none of the people who have written about this trial have picked up on this. And maybe it's all in my own head, but I would urge everyone, read the trial transcript, write out a timeline, and see what you think, because it leaped out rather clearly to me.
That's because you're a novelist. Right. Anybody who's actually done trial work knows that the best story wins regardless of the facts in court. I mean, it's just... Well, yeah, but the best presentation is selling the story.
Well,
right.
The funny thing, though, with this whole melancholy laudanum addict story was it didn't sell at the time. This was a losing argument. And again, I think it's partially because the testimony was so overwhelmingly about how lively Elma was. This whole she was melancholy and trying to kill herself story just didn't really work. But it's something that has persisted in modern writings about the case, which, I
have to say it was a failure of judgment on the part of her family to leave her alone, a young woman with a whole bunch of guys in a boarding house and go. If anybody's culpable in this thing, it seems to me it would actually be her female relatives that didn't think, wait, this is a really bad idea.
Yes.
Yeah, you wouldn't do that. I wouldn't do that.
Well, and they were also leaving her to the prey. They're fleeing the yellow fever. And she's, I think this says a lot about Elma and her position in the family.
Yeah.
She's the disposable family member.
Right.
She's the one who, if she gets yellow fever, no one will really weep too hard.
Right. Meantime, she can run the business and keep it afloat. Yes. Wow. Okay. Well, we can't tell you how it comes out. There is supposed to be some element of surprise in the story. So... I will say, very copious sources, various copious footnotes. I mean, it is a novel, but Lauren's done a great job in giving you leads if you want to pursue it yourself, which I think is a great idea. What inspired you to write this story?
Honestly, it was a historical rabbit hole I fell down and couldn't get out again, because I'm a native New Yorker. I grew up there. We were surrounded by a lot of New York history when I was little. And because I've written a couple of Gilded Age New York books, I am subscribed to all of these Instagram sites about New York buildings and New York history. And about 5 years ago or so, someone posted something about the Levi Weeks trial. And like so many other people, I thought, how cool. Burr and Hamilton 4 years before the fatal duel together in the courtroom to save a young man from the gallows. And of course, I got interested in the right case for all the wrong reasons, because what caught my attention, like so many other people, was this idea of Hamilton and Burr as co-counsel, which seemed kind of weird and fabulous. Of course, one of the things I discovered as I was researching this case was that wasn't the weird bit at all. They were co-counsel in a number of cases. And it's funny because even people who've written this case will say things like, oh, the oddity of them together in the courtroom. It wasn't odd. The New York bar was really small. There were roughly 50 lawyers, and they were co-counsel on a number of other cases at the same time. So this wasn't weird. But what did happen was I read that very popular nonfiction book, which is a great read. And at the time, I didn't realize that everything in it was wrong. And I thought, okay, well, I'll just go take a look at the transcript. And I started reading the transcript, and that was it. I was hooked because these people were so interesting and so complicated and so real. And I wanted to know who killed Elma Sands. And then I went back to that nonfiction book because some of the things I thought, wait, this doesn't seem borne out by what I'm reading in the transcript. I started following up the footnotes, and I realized none of them made sense. And that a lot of the details people have repeated about this case have actually been, it's a giant historical game of telephone, where people have repeated things until they sound true, but they're not true. And you poke them or you follow the footnotes and they fall apart. So it wound up being this amazing puzzle to reconstruct all of this stuff and put it back together. And actually one of the craziest not true bits was there's a question about why Hamilton took the case, because he was really busy at this point of his life. He was Inspector General of the Army. He had a busy commercial law practice. He's trying to keep Burr's Republicans from winning elections. He's got a lot on his plate, and he doesn't do criminal law. But the story that's always told is that he was in debt to Ezra Weeks because Ezra was a contractor on the Grange, and that Ezra comes to him and says, okay, you haven't paid me yet for my work. You can defend my brother. And it sounds like a great story, and it seems to make sense. And the story always is that Hamilton reluctantly takes the case because he owes Ezra this money, except that one of the things I found when I started poking around was Hamilton doesn't buy the land on which the Grange is situated until August 1800, 4 months after the trial. He doesn't hire the architect, John McComb, until 1801. So how is he in debt to Ezra for a house for which he doesn't yet own the land, hasn't hired the architect, and certainly hasn't started building? And yeah, exactly. And so I mean, I found the only person who had flagged this was a very meticulous legal historian from the 1950s who had pointed out that this does not work. But that he posited that, yes, we know Hamilton was already thinking of a country house. Hamilton being Hamilton and good contractors being hard to find, he was probably thinking, okay, I'm going to need a contractor. If I defend this guy's brother, he'll be indebted to me and he'll build my house even if he's really busy. And also he knew this was going to be the media sensation of the year. And he did not want Burr right before the April 1800 elections getting all the attention. But it flips the narrative. It's not Hamilton being asked to favor. It's Hamilton inserting himself into the case. And that changes so much about his motivation, about the way the trial is conducted, about the relationship between the lawyers. And that's just one of the many things I found as I was researching this, that you think looks like it makes sense, and then it doesn't follow, and you have to go rebuild it from the bottom up.
So you've written wonderful historical fiction for, as you point out, half your life. What are you thinking about doing next?
Well, funny story there. I was going to write about another famous historical American trial, the Nancy Randolph infanticide case, and her resulting romance with my favorite founding father, Gouverneur Morris, the Scarlet Pimpernel of America. But I had been researching it, I'd been working on it, and I just happened to mention to my agent over lunch an idea I'd had, a fun little idea about a paranormal contemporary romance set at Greenwood Cemetery in Brooklyn. And she looked at me and said, drop everything and write that. I said, wait, but I'm under contract for the Gouverneur Morris book. And she said, don't worry, I'll call your editor. And she called my editor, and my editor said, drop everything. Write the contemporary paranormal romance. So I dropped poor Gouverneur Morris. I really hope his feelings weren't too hurt. And
He'll still be there. You could come back to
he'll
it.
still be actually funny thing. I found out after I had switched to working on the paranormal contemporary romance that in fact someone had just written a book about Nancy Randolph and Gouverneur Morris that came out later that year. But anyway, the paranormal contemporary romance is all written. It's called What Happens at Nightfall, and it's going to come out in autumn of 2026.
Wow, that's going to be fun. A complete difference. Proving once again that we have, these kind of trends that we follow in publishing. And, I think as an author, if you see that people are reading something, maybe it's fun to give it a try.
Well, and I think we are what we read. And I, in particular, I know there are some authors who are really good at resisting trends, and they just write what they write. And they have their own specific thing that they do in season and out of season. And when the market goes their way, they become popular. And when it doesn't, they just go on writing it anyway. And I'm an impulse reader, and I read voraciously. And so what I write is strongly affected by what I read. And so those early books, the Pink Carnation books, were because I was reading Georgette Heyer and Julia Quinn and so on, and a lot of British chick lit. And they took those and turned those to genre stew. And then I wrote a bunch of dual timeline novels because I was reading a lot of Kate Morgan. And God only knows where this came from. But anyway, and I've been reading a lot of Emily Wilde's Map of Fairyland and those books and those sorts of things. And so I guess that somehow led to a paranormal contemporary romance for me. But so I find I am constantly morphing because what I'm reading is morphing.
I think that's a wonderful answer. Good for you. How about questions? Any of you like to ask anything about?
This new book, I mean, because it's completely different from all your historical fiction, are you not having to do as much research now since it's...
Can you repeat the
Well,
question?
Oh, sorry. The question was because this book is not historical fiction, do I not have to do as much research? I will find research if it doesn't find me. So this book is set at Greenwood Cemetery in Brooklyn, which is basically, it was an inspiration for Central Park. It was the beginning of the rural cemetery movement where people had this idea of, okay, our cemeteries and cities are really crowded and unsightly. What if we go find this big plot of land like a park and people can wander through it and build big, beautiful monuments and contemplate mortality? And there's Mount Auburn Cemetery in Boston, which was also part of this movement. But so Greenwood is this amazing 500 plus acre place with hills and mausoleums and what they call their permanent residents, who include all sorts of crazy characters ranging from Governor DeWitt Clinton to Basquiat. Am I mispronouncing his name? I'm not a modern art person. Basquiat. Anyway, but you know who I mean, the modern art guy.
And isn't there a whole Tiffany glass chapel?
There are these amazing mausoleums that have incredible Tiffany glass and things inside, and marble and sculpture. I mean, there's all sorts of artistry and ghost stories and crazy characters. And so I actually wound up doing a lot of research for this book because there was of course, I wanted to get the details of Greenwood Cemetery right, both the permanent residents and the hero of the book is the arborist at Greenwood, the director of horticulture. And that's a real job there. So I had to have a sense of what does the director of horticulture at Greenwood do? How does Greenwood work? And all those sorts of things. But there's also a historical element because there is a sort of mystery adventure aspect in the book because an angry demon an angry Renaissance demon that was imprisoned in a crypt in the Gilded Age has escaped and is wreaking havoc. And my hero and heroine have to figure out what happened in the Gilded Age, why that demon was summoned and then imprisoned in order to defeat it before it can wreak havoc again. So I find research. Right now I am working on well, we'll see if I actually wind up writing this book, but the sequel to follow that book involving characters from the first book, which would involve Henry Hudson, John Dee, the famous Elizabethan occultist, and Rip Van Winkle. So more historical deep dives, even though it's contemporary.
A lot of historical figures gathered to the cemetery, aren't there? Love it. Right. Who else has a question? Anybody?
You can pick who gets to go.
I'm going to go way back there and come back to you.
When I went to New York, I listened to the Bowery Boys a lot, and I just love that stuff. But they talked about this murder, and they gave an address, and where the well is still there.
Well,
Based on a story. Do you know if that's true? I have the address still on my phone, but nobody wanted to go see it with me.
129 Spring Street, and there are ghost tours that go through. People claim they can hear Elma still crying for justice. But funny story. So I include in the historical note of this book that you can still see the well at 129 Spring Street. And after the book had gone to press, I was talking to an urban historian who's really knows his stuff, is very reliable, and he told me this is a fallacy. That in fact, that's a later cistern dating from about 1810. So if you're hearing Elma, that's not Elma you're hearing. And that the real well, we don't know exactly where it is, but the most likely place for it is somewhere under Green Street. That someone in the 50s thought they had located it. And I feel like part of me is embarrassed that I put misinformation in the book, and part of me feels like this is kind of a learning moment because it's so emblematic of this case as a whole. Here was something that was presented to me as fact, and there was no reason to doubt it. Everyone said that was the well. People said they heard Elma there. And in fact, if this other guy is right, and I've spoken to other people since who've told me the same thing, this is in fact not the well, but everyone says it is.
So was it a water source? Was it the or a water source for the city?
Well, you may regret the length of the answer you're going to get here.
Okay.
This well is actually very important to the story in other ways because, so as I may have mentioned before, yellow fever, big problem in the city. And Burr's brother-in-law, Dr. Thomas Brown, had this idea that maybe bad water caused yellow fever. I mean, he was wrong, but nice, good try. Thank you for playing. And so he came up with a scheme. They could bring water from upstate and give New Yorkers a source of clean water to prevent yellow fever. And Burr took this to Hamilton and said, I want to form a company, the Manhattan Company, to bring clean water to the city. And Hamilton thought this was a brilliant idea. And he was like, sure, I'll help. So he drafts the legislation for Burr. He goes and lobbies his friends in the legislature. He gets his Federalist friends to sit on the Board of Governors. And right before the bill goes up before the legislature, Burr sneaks in a clause enabling the Manhattan Company to use its surplus funds, not being used for water stuff, to make loans and raise credit. Basically, what Burr was creating wasn't a water company, it was a bank deliberately designed to rival Hamilton's Bank of New York and be a piggy bank for Burr and the Republican Party. And Hamilton makes it happen for him. So the only person who notices this is this guy, Judge Lansing, who's actually the judge in the Levi Weeks trial, who points this out and votes against it, but the bill passes because Hamilton has so successfully drafted it and lobbied for it, and Burr's water company goes through. And because it was never about the water, he immediately cheaps out on the water aspect of it. And all Dr. Thomas Brown's big plans about patent water wheels and bringing water from upstate get thrown out. Instead, they're going to use an existing body of water in the city called the Collect, and they're going to lay pipes from the Collect to newly dug wells, one of which is the Manhattan Well in which Elma drowns. And the contractor they hire to dig these wells and lay these pipes. Oh, which, by the way, they cheap out on the pipes. They don't even use metal because, again, it's not about the water. They use board logs, which disintegrate within 20 years. But the contractor who bores these logs and lays these pipes and digs this well is Ezra Weeks. And that's why Burr takes the case. But yeah, the Manhattan well, it's a sore spot for Hamilton in a number of ways.
Well, he got played.
He got totally.
Absolutely.
It's typical of his relationship with Burr. So yes, this is. It's not crucial to the city's water source, but it's part of this water plan that was supposed to be so much more.
You had a question.
So how long did you spend researching all this?
A lot longer than I'd mentioned. This book took me about 2 years to research. Sweet summer child that I was, I thought, oh, great, there are 2 nonfiction books on this. There are all these articles. This is going to be so easy. Other people will have done the legwork for me. And then it really was. I started following up the footnotes and realizing nothing fit together and nothing made sense. And some things were just clearly, plainly, flat out wrong. And that's when I had to start going and hitting the archives and putting stuff together. And it took about a year and a half of pure research before I felt ready to sit down and tackle writing it, before I felt like I had a handle on the shape of the story. And part of what was so hard was I had to forget the story I thought I knew. Because again, that nonfiction book that came out a few years ago, it's very compelling and I had loved it. But then I realized I had to try to make myself forget what I thought I knew from that book because I knew it didn't hold up, and that was hard.
It's like studying Russian, where you have to figure, the alphabet is different, but a lot of it looks like the Roman alphabet. So you have to teach yourself, that a P is not a P, and a B is actually a V, and an M is a T, and it's so hard.
Yeah.
Once your brain is accustomed to, that recognition, to retrain it is really difficult.
Yeah.
So I can see your problem. Does anybody have a final question they'd like to ask? No?
Are you worried I'm going to talk for half an hour about a water company? Okay.
Actually, I think that's fascinating. And it turns out that New York does actually get its water from out of New York, doesn't it now?
That later on.
Yeah, later
they go
on.
and they follow through and
So
they bring it in from
it wasn't,
elsewhere.
it was an idea, it was a good idea. It just didn't get executed.
I know, and I felt so sorry for Burr's brother-in-law because he really meant it about the water
Right.
project, and he's so sad when the Manhattan Company basically throws out all his plans.
Yeah. I've been interested to read lately that the old Roman aqueducts are coming back into play. The places where the aqueducts were, they're now realizing that they can reutilize them to bring water into places. We're going to Roman France in May, and one of the things we're going to be looking at are the what's it called, the famous aqueduct there.
Oh, I can picture the one you mean
Right.
because our French teacher used to show us pictures of it.
Right, it's near Avignon. The Pont du Gard, that's it, it's the Pont du Gard. Anyway, I think it's great. The Romans really knew how to build to last. So, here we go again. But, right, anyway, thank you all very much for your attention. Lauren, it's been such a treat to have you back and talk to you, listen to you, whatever.
Thank you so much for having me here. Thank you for coming.
Thank you very much for coming. Virtual audience, thank you for watching. If you'd like to visit with Lauren, get a book signed, take a photo, I think she'll just stay right here.
Yes.